I'm now kind of the opinion that if you're someone who's interested in building a product, you have like no excuse to not be participating in code. It's hard, and like it will take a little bit of like what is the sort of stuff that kind of sets you up to do it correctly. But if you are someone who is business ambitious, like wants to create a thing and put it out into the world, and you trust yourself to have a brand that you can distribute with, you can easily get to coding, like very, very easily. Because I only code insofar as if I recognize Cursor has gone off the rails to catch it and send it back. So in my typical like art, I suppose, of like how to use these AI tools, my typical procedure is I know the product I'm working on. So usually you can go to a Cursor, you can go to whatever your hosting platform is, tell them like, give me a base template that does XYZ thing, right? If you need monetization, you need accounts, you can usually rip those offline, like for free, like no problem. Like most of these tools provide that free out of the box. Then I will typically go ahead, start with, I need a product that does this, just skeleton it out. Don't try and like build the whole thing. Just start really high level. Give me the structure of an app that, for example, does food delivery, right? And it'll do a really good job giving you basic components, laying out the page, respecting your structure. You just want to make sure that you're prompting it in a way that it knows what libraries it should be using, what stylization it should be using, because otherwise it might mix stuff up or keep things inconsistent. Once I've done that, most of the like rest of work is just prompt, recognize when I've hit a good checkpoint. So I'll leave breadcrumbs for myself inside of the prompting to know like this is the progress that just happened. And if something goes off path, I can always tell Cursor to go back and check out at that point. So always do something like that. And when there's a really good checkout point, commit that thing to Git. For those who are non-technical, commit to Git just means like store my code's progress up in the cloud effectively. Hey everybody, welcome to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Today we're operating without Damon. I forgot what his intro is, to be honest. But welcome back. Wherever you're listening, whether it's Spotify, YouTube, Damon usually says something like that.
Something about subscribe to the whatever.
Yeah, subscribe, comment,
all that
like,
stuff.
I don't know, just get all that stuff out early right now. Yeah, Shashi, welcome back. We've had a pretty fun week just at the company level. There's a lot of stuff going on. I'd love for you to just give the general set of updates as to what we're up to.
We had a super productive week. We got our YC app in, which was kind of the least, like this is maybe our like third or fourth time doing a YC app. And this is like the least dramatic, like the sort of easiest, least stressful version of getting the YC app in. I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, it may be a really horrible sign, but it was kind of, it was great to get that in, great to feel kind of quick flow and connection with the story we're telling. And what I like is that we're going to do what we're going to do no matter what. And YC can be part of that or not. And either way is cool, but I feel like we have a really good direction. I'm excited to be able to help students. It's especially international students. It connects well with what we are about as people. And so it's exciting news that Notilo has launched. So that's the big news. Yeah. And in the first few days have over 100 users and lots of engagement. So congrats. Well done, Lakshya.
Yeah, you actually haven't seen the update. I think we're at approach. I can literally check the database right now. We're approaching what I believe is like 600 users signed in. And that's like, again, we're really lucky in that like a lot of traction. I think we've always done a pretty okay job like directing people towards things and keeping folks kind of engaged with our content and material. The most difficult challenge now is like make the product that gets a lot of love. But I think for folks who have known us, like we started off making tools that are meant to kind of like fix problems with ChatGPT and like help fight hallucinations, especially in places like that were relatively high stakes, like science, medicine. And that's been ongoing. It's continued to be good. And like, again, like it's the backing off of which we kind of continue to live. But we want to kind of focus more on education. So we're just beginning a lot of this sort of stuff. But we found with a lot of our users, especially international ones, that are going through a lot of hoops to kind of compete at like the typical university setting, to compete in the typical exam, like standardized testing setting. There's just so many problems that are experienced by that particular cohort that a lot of our user love always kind of came from folks who are international first, but living in like a Western setting. And so there's a lot to do there, but we're building all sorts of things. Notilo that just launched that Shashi alluded to is our attempt to kind of make Duolingo for basically any class. So you can kind of treat it as a classroom companion that like listens to your lectures, converts your notes, helps you kind of like manage a learning journey. But we're experimenting a lot. Shashi's also building a couple of other things on the exam side that might be kind of interesting.
And just to round out, so everyone understands the success we've had so far with ScholarAI, we've had 600,000 plus users including users at NVIDIA, at Harvard, Stanford, Amazon, many of the name brand organizations that you've heard of. ScholarAI has users at every one of those organizations. So we've had a lot of success so far in our apps, and the latest one, Notilo, is aimed at students, in particular international students. The goal is we help them crush their classes using the best of AI,
Yeah.
customizing it to the content and customizing it to the student. There's nothing else in the market that does that. I love the anecdote about the students who were trying to cobble together their own solutions for this.
Mhm.
Can you say some more about that anecdote?
Telling us about how a lot of our peers, what they're doing, especially those who are English first, is they're stringing together lecture transcription tools. They're stringing together note-taking tools. They're stringing together like ChatGPT to translate. They're putting all these LM tools that like someone like us that's immersed in space are kind of used to using. Like I know I'd use Claude for coding. I'm going to do that for that one specific task. I'm going to use this for one specific task. Whereas that individual is building a tool suite for themselves that is like 8 or 9 different devices or workflows kind of strung together to kind of achieve the final outcome that just feels like that person's going through enough of a pain point that they're clearly figuring out ways to hack together solutions. We think we can make it a lot smoother effectively. And so that's the kind of like person that we care about. So especially if you are that person, you're listening, get in touch. I know that like both Shashi and I are Indian. I know a lot of the audience of this podcast is Indian. And if you'd like to talk shop in Hindi sometime and figure out like, hey, I'm at an IIT or I'm like from going to college at some Western university, but I'm from India and I kind of resonate with what you're kind of talking about, we'd love to talk to you. So you can reach us on one of our channels. We're active on Twitter. We're active on LinkedIn. Come find us and we'd be happy to figure out like how can we make something that makes your life way, way easier.
It's awesome. And we have more juicy things on the way yet to be announced in development, and excited to get those to market and show those to you.
Yeah, I think there's just I think the product as it currently stands, there's just so many learnings I've had in just like what the last like 2 years basically of like building AI apps has been that I'm kind of like really happy. Kind of, it's not a fresh slate. Like obviously we're benefiting from like so much leverage and like distribution that we already have. But I have been very much appreciating being able to like reflect on like what was LM development 2 years ago. Scholar has all of those assumptions still baked in. I can't wipe them out because I'll destroy the app if I wipe them out. But now I kind of finally get to like be just like, yes, I fully understand what's the thing to build. I tell Cursor, it goes and does it. I wake up like I take a nap for like 5 seconds. I look and the feature's done. So nice.
All right, so this is a great segue into our first topic. So let's talk about AI development tools, how they're
Yeah.
working for you in your experience. What models do you like? Have you tried different models? Have you tried different IDEs? What do you like?
Yeah. Yeah. So being very, very specific to what I've been up to. So ChatGPT a while ago launched the Assistance API. This was their attempt at making a very high level API that anyone could build a chatbot off of. And we used that for ScholarAI. We used it for the like core app because they're just like free and easy, like get it done, knock it out, cool. But the challenge in that is that there's been so much interest in these non-OpenAI models, right? People want DeepSeek, people want Claude, people recognize Gemini is really good at long form context. And we want to be able to mix all this stuff in. And so I've had to like basically home cook. Like I'm a hater, not a hater, but I'm not a fan of what LangChain is. Like I want to learn what LangChain is, and LangChain would solve these problems. But I wanted to just be able to string together and like change my models very freely without dealing with LangChain. And so I'd spent a number of like too many cycles, way too many cycles on trying to get the LM to correctly code up of basically my own assistance API that I can use for anything. And Cursor has been a godsend. I've also found O3 Mini really, really good. I'm very wary of paying per usage on Claude. So I just like use like, or paying per usage on Cursor. So I'm just using Claude 3.5, which is part of like the vanilla subscription. But I found that like I debug a little bit. I ask Cursor, I pass in everything I know is relevant. So again, I know my code base. I dump all the 7 files I know are relevant to the task at hand. I give it the product description. It spins out a first attempt. I've been lucky in that, like, especially for front stuff, it'll knock it out first or second try, which is really great. I have found, and Shashi, I know you've run into this a lot, that when it goes down a wrong path and you're not aware it's going down a wrong path, it can really, really go off like the deep end, which is really annoying.
Hmm. My experience is similar. So I started using Cursor before agentic mode, before there's a YOLO mode where you can just kind of let the agent go crazy and do everything, including use all the tools and terminal and everything.
Yeah.
And that's that's newer than my first experience with Cursor. So I first used Cursor when it was just the chat version. And
Hmm.
so you would be on a section of code and you would give it that section of code or the entire file and you'd chat and you'd say, I want to do this with this piece of code. And that felt really kind of choppy and imprecise. And even if it was an 80%, it felt like a lot of work to figure out where the 20% was. And so I felt like there were a lot of lost cycles in that. So I didn't stay with it. In summary, my first contact with Cursor was one where I saw in the ways in which it was useful, but it wasn't saving me enough time in aggregate. And so I stopped using it. And then when I came back to it, I learned how to use the composer mode and composer with the agent mode rather than normal. So there's kind of an agent setting where it will do sequential prompts for you, and then the normal where you kind of give it one prompt at a time. And then you can turn on the YOLO mode in the settings. And so turning on the YOLO mode and using Composer instead of chat was a completely different experience
Yeah.
in using Cursor and much more yielding. So I felt like I was going from 1x. I felt like my first experience was 1x to 1x, and my second experience was like 1x to 5x. And I think, and maybe this is helpful for the audience, is the difference between 5xing yourself and 10xing yourself is really the art of knowing how to prompt and how to use Cursor
Hmm.
and how to use GitHub to break up your project into pieces and how to
Yeah.
use project requirement documents. Can you talk about what's your method for that?
Yeah. So the thing I'll preface with is that like my background's fully technical. Like from the beginning, my job and role in like what our group is has been like very purely coding, right? It's like hands on keyboards, pump work out, get features done, reply to users, keep reacting with features, right? Historically, that used to be like again, look up documentations, go like read like how this API thing is written, copy and paste that in. GitHub Copilot was just emerging at the time that like ScholarAI started. So at best, I was able to be like, hey, take this like JavaScript template I'm giving you and just like modify it for the variables I have. So it's super light. I'm now kind of the opinion that if you're someone who's interested in building a product, you have like no excuse to not be participating in code. It's hard and like it will take a little bit of like what is the sort of stuff that kind of sets you up to do it correctly. But if you are someone who is business ambitious, like wants to create a thing and put it out into the world, and you trust yourself to have a brand that you can distribute with, you can easily get to coding, like very easily. Because I only code insofar as if I recognize cursor has gone off the rails to catch it and send it back. So in my typical like art, I suppose, of like how to use these AI tools, my typical procedure is I know the product I'm working on. So usually you can go to a Cursor, you can go to whatever your hosting platform is, tell them like, give me a base template that does XYZ thing, right? If you need monetization, you need accounts, you can usually rip those offline, like for free, like no problem. Like most of these tools provide that free out of the box. Then I will typically go ahead, start with, I need a product that does this, just skeleton it out. Don't try and like build the whole thing. Just start really high level. Give me the structure of an app that, for example, does food delivery, right? And it'll do a really good job giving you basic components, laying out the page, respecting your structure. You just want to make sure that you're prompting it in a way that it knows what libraries it should be using, what stylization it should be using, because otherwise it might mix stuff up or keep things inconsistent. Once I've done that, most of the like rest of work is just prompt, recognize when I've hit a good checkpoint. So I'll leave breadcrumbs for myself inside of the prompting to know like this is the progress that just happened. And if something goes off path, I can always tell Cursor to go back and check out at that point. So always do something like that. And when there's a really good checkout point, commit that thing to Git. For those who are non-technical, commit to Git just means like store my code's progress up in the cloud effectively. It's that sort of combination that allows me to basically just be a product manager rather than an engineer, because all I'm doing is I'm telling the machine like, here are your product requirements. As in, if you're my engineer, I recognize that you're going off a path. Here's where I want you to go back to and try again with the knowledge that I know of where you went
Hmm.
wrong.
Hmm. That's great.
Yeah.
I'll tell you my method, which is probably less good than yours. So I start with a Claude UI window, so outside of Cursor,
Mm-hmm.
and I start with who I am, and I present myself as the engineering manager, and I present that Claude instance as a product manager. So I define its role as product manager and my role as engineering manager. I say, here's the high level project we're trying to achieve. I want you to, the task is to write a product requirement document.
Hmm.
And before you start writing, to ask any clarifying questions. So I give it a lot of information up front, including role information, and I ask it to ask me back clarifying questions before it begins drafting. So I do that. It asks a bunch of questions, which are usually really good and annoying. They're good questions that are annoying to have to answer.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, I guess I should answer this question. And so you go through that process a couple of times, maybe two or three rounds of that, and it has all the sort of peripheral fact set, and it will generate the product requirement document. What I do then is I save that PRD file. I save it as a markdown file in my Git folder. So I put that in my Git folder, and the reason I put it there is because in Cursor I want to attach that file, and then what I
Mm.
do is I do a Git checkout. But what I was doing wrong before, when Cursor was going astray before, what I was doing is too big of a project chunk at once. And so I was prompting it to do several different things. I would prompt it to create a database and put in a bunch of schema requirement rules, and then start coding backend, and then start coding front end. And then what would happen is when it would get to, for example, coding the front end, it would say, I can't find this database, so I'm going to create a new one. And I can't input data into the schema. I'm just going to create a new schema. And it would just do all of these things in a circular fashion, so that if it did the latest thing I asked, it would mess up the first thing in the sequence.
Yeah.
So that's where I was making a mistake. So in talking to Lakshya and getting kind of his advice on how to approach the problem, I'm now breaking that up into small pieces and just coding that piece. But the first part of what I said, getting the product requirement document, putting it in GitHub, and then attaching that in Cursor and saying this is the one piece of the project we're completing, has been really successful. What I do is I keep that Claude instance open, and I say, okay, now for step one of this project, give me a very detailed technical requirement. And I
Mm.
take that and I use that in my prompt. So that creates, and I prompt it to give me a checklist. So if stage one of the project is like 16 steps in a checklist, I paste that into Cursor. I paste that into Cursor, and I say, let's complete for the first 5 steps of this checklist. Start. So I try to spoon feed it, and all of this is to say what we're circumventing is the overload of context and trying to do too many things at once. And in order to overcome that, what I'm doing is doing a lot of manual context feeding, being very curated about how much context I give in any specific prompt, and keeping that really narrow so that it will just complete the task at hand.
The pretty interesting thing is, I mean, I think Cursor has like very much established a really, really strong foothold just in like what is the Copilot space. Like they fully like kicked Microsoft out of the conversation, which is a crazy thing to have done.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that's very interesting is like even your process is something that like you could add automations to take out work for yourself if you wanted
Hmm.
to, right? Like
Hmm.
the act of going and talking to Claude and then dumping that into GitHub or whatever, you could absolutely like, and this is like almost like closer to what a Devin might want to do is like you might give yourself a UI one day where you just like say like here are my product requirements. It recognizes how to break up those product requirements. It does interviews with you to understand them, and it goes back and
Yeah.
just manages the PR cycle to ensure that like once it figures out like oh I've definitely built up too much context, I got to stop. When it's able to like recognize that's happened and spin up a new fresh window with more information, like you're chilling. Like you don't need to
Yeah.
engineer anymore. You're just relaxed, just taking your way
Yeah.
through things measly.
But do you wonder? I kind of feel like maybe models are just going to get good enough that
Mm,
this is going to go away. Like this, if like
yeah,
even if I made an interface for myself to do all
yeah,
of these kind of problem
yeah.
chunking things that I'm doing, I
Mhm.
wonder if it all just goes away with GPT-5.
I hope so. I think the thing that I found, and just like in my, so I find that like Cursor when they added the agentic mode, the I still have to be pretty pointed. I think there's two sets of problems in here, right? One is context, and one is how's that context traversed through. Where I think now that they've added this agentic mode, like the way that they choose to select code doesn't feel perfect to me. I think so. In most of the times I'm starting a new feature, like I find that I just have higher and faster results if I'm very intentional about what files I tell Cursor to look at, right? So if I know like I'm dealing with a chat feature, I give it all my chat components, I give it my chat backend, I give it the chat definitions. rather than trusting it to do its own thing. Because if it misses a file, all of a
Mm.
sudden now it's going to like duplicate code. And I've even found like I get lazy all the time. Like after a certain point, I like stop looking at the code. Like this happened like 1 or 2 months ago. I just let Cursor do its thing, and it took me like 2 or 3 like PR features later to realize like wait, like I created like one class definition 3 different ways,
Hmm.
and they're all imported in different places, and that's going to create a bigger problem for you later on if Cursor is just trying to look up like, hey, let me find this class. I see 3 definitions. Which one do I use? I don't know. I'm going to wipe the other 2 and break a feature. So it's interesting. I think
Yeah.
I do think it'll go away. I haven't tried putting O3 Mini inside of Cursor. Again, I'm just
Okay.
not paying that way. But one thing I do that I told Joshi about is sometimes Cursor with Claude 3.5, I just get stuck on a problem and can't like take an objective like answer to like how to approach something, especially given that it has context built up. So one thing I'll do is I will grab the file I care about. I'll grab the logs or the problems I recognize are present in it. I'll carry all that over. I'll put it into O3 Mini, describe what it's having, and have it come up with like the overall strategy, like what needs to be debugged for this thing to work. And O3 Mini is not as fast as Cursor is on generating code, or like it won't insert into my database super cleanly. But I'll ask O3 to come up with the debug strategy. I'll give that back to Cursor and have it follow that like sequentially until it works.
Mm. Nice.
I found that to be really, really good too.
Nice.
I think it's especially interesting because it's been like a long while since you've coded, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
How are you
Yeah.
finding like your experience of coding back when you were in your 20s to today? Like how much of a leap has it been?
It's just a totally different practice. When I
Yeah.
was coding after undergrad, this is 20 years ago, it was a lot of hand typing code. And that was the art is was knowing at that point how to hand type the code, remembering the right libraries. Yes, there were places you could look up the right libraries, but really it was felt much more manual, and now it
Yeah.
feels much more like putting modules of things together, like connecting modules of things is what the practice of it feels like. And obviously with the advent of AI and an IDE like Cursor, or other people prefer Windsurf, those kinds of IDEs change the entire game of coding. It still helps a lot to know. I still don't think we're in the place where a Devon style approach of like a non-engineer is able to successfully use these things. I think it really still helps to know what is a database and what is a schema, what does JavaScript do versus what does Python do for you. Like just kind of knowing like the pieces of the puzzle still helps a lot in my experience. And I still have that from my early days of coding, but the day-to-day practice of coding is a very different practice.
Have you played it all with Vercel or like Vercel v0 or Replit?
I've not used Replit. I've used V0 for front end
Hmm.
development, and I really like it. I think it's really useful. And so this is a great place to segue. So I want to put on screen a couple of screens. And so this first is about how quickly Cursor has grown in just 4 months, grown to, I believe it's shared here. They've raised another $100 million at a $2.6 billion valuation. And they've grown to, I believe, over 100 million ARR in just 2 years. 4 million a month in October. So rapid growth. So this is one post. And then the second post I wanted to put up is a quote by Balaji. And this is a sort of tongue in cheek that it might turn out that the GPT wrapper has more of a moat than the GPT. And so what I want to kind of pose this to you as a question, Lakshay, which is early on, and when I say early on, I mean 2 years ago, in conversations with VCs and the way this all went, there was a dichotomy. The framework that VCs were using is that there are foundation models and there are wrappers, and everything falls into one of those two buckets. And so if you're not building a foundation model, you're building a wrapper because you're doing something with the foundation model. I would propose that the architecture that we should be talking about this with is actually much more like an operating system. I think what we are seeing is instead an operating system and the applications that are being built onto the operating system. And so I would propose that that's the right framework to think about it, and that there is no operating system that builds all of the end user applications that create the real value for a person who's buying the computer.
Yeah.
there have always been attempts by, for example, Apple to build the most used apps, but Safari is not the most used browser. There have been attempts by Microsoft to build the most used apps, but still people use other things that are not Microsoft built on a Windows computer. And so I guess I'm just want to pose this to you, both the biology quote about GPT versus wrapper paradigm, and then kind of, do you think this operating system paradigm makes sense?
It actually used to scare me because we got labeled a GPT wrapper a lot. I think especially being really naive about just like startups and everything. I think my perspective, especially being an engineer, is like, I have to have a technical moat. We have to have a technical moat. Like, take actions that feel technically moatable, because that feels like a correct thing to do, especially given the VC conversation. And I think the thing that's changed, at least in my perspective, is like, it's all about distribution. It's no longer like, if software is commoditized, like what matters is like, do you have a brand, and can you get a tool that sells more globally or can sell itself? Cursor does really, really well because I think when they first launched, they were very generous with how much usage you could get. So adoption was really quick, and they're really quick to iterate, and user love was just so, so high. You and I are able to talk about in conversation, recommend it to anyone listening. So they just ace product and they get free word of mouth, right? It's that sort of thing that like builds a business, not the technology, I guess. And even, I think even OpenAI, Claude themselves are kind of dancing around between like, should we be building an app or should we be building infra? Like they're lost from it because they keep doing both.
Right.
And so I think I do think the operating system approach is the correct one. I don't think I think especially DeepSeek, there's just been a big upset in like what the infrastructure space is like. And I don't think I was reading an article today about how Anthropic is kind of flipping between like, should we be expecting subscriptions to be our big cash winners, or should we be selling API usage and trusting that we become an OS thing? And I do think it's very much the correct analysis. We'll see how it plays out. I think OpenAI is probably the furthest along on properly being a quote unquote operating system, just because so much of their API and the way their infrastructure is provided is really friendly to development. But there's just still so much to do. I think ultimately, again, anyone listening, like if someone were to come at me today for making a GPT wrapper, I would not be offended. Like I'd just like say like, I differ with your perspective by quite a lot. I think it's perfectly appropriate to be building a GPT wrapper because it's just such a highly enabling technology.
Cursor is a great example of, they are not building a foundation model. They're building something clearly on top of foundation models.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see which layers of abstraction are helpful versus unnecessary waste or expense. So we're seeing Cursor as a layer of abstraction above the model for the purpose of software engineering to be really helpful in the way that they deliver it. And hopefully what we're building with ScholarAI and with Notilo is really helpful as a layer of abstraction that makes it easier for the end user to get the value they're trying to get, rather than going directly to a foundation model and trying to cobble together their own thing. Because you and I can go to Claude, we can go to O3 Mini, we can copy and paste our own code in and tell it to do things. But the way that the application is developed in Cursor saves us time and effort, and it's worth us paying money to Cursor to do that.
Yeah, ultimately there's like there's so much like knowledge and like I guess like developed brain share that goes into like, how do I prompt a thing to do the thing I want to, like where am I copying and pasting the results? That's what Cursor fundamentally is, right? It's like, it's search over a database, it's prompt, and it's copy and paste the results into where I want to go. You or I could do that, like very trivially, you and I can do that. But it's just like, if I can have a machine take care of those three things for me for free, that saves me like multiple hours per day, multiple hours per day.
Yeah.
That again, like we in talking to users, like students are doing that so much, and especially as like generations are growing up on AI now, like people are figuring out the tricks of the trade and trying to put together their toolkit. But if the toolkit has its own brain, that's perfect.
Yeah. All right, let's change gears one more time. People come to us for tech news, and so I wanna talk about secondaries today. So what these are private companies that exist in the world that are not publicly traded, so you can't go buy their stock on a stock exchange. These are companies that, what happens is the employees of those companies, shareholders of the company, can sell their shares on a market called a secondary market, which means if you are an early employee at SpaceX, for example, and you have a meaningful position, let's say you want to sell $1 million of stock in SpaceX, what you could do is sell it at something like that $350 billion latest round of valuation, and sell it to somebody else who wants to be an investor and own that stake of the company. So that's called a secondary. And what you're seeing here is a list of, there's 20 on the list, but what I'm showing you here is the top 17 companies in terms of demand for their secondary stock. Okay, so what this is saying is that SpaceX has the highest demand for secondary stock. And I know people who are putting together these SPVs, they're special purpose vehicles for investing in SpaceX, and they charge fees to be able to get access to SpaceX stock.
Yeah,
And the reason they charge those fees is they go fetch the other side of the market for you. They go get the
I
shares,
see.
put them into the pool, and they charge you a fee, and that's how they make their money.
Is this
So
something that like I mean I assume you're able to access this just because like
yeah,
network and folks you know that sort of thing? Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There are SPVs for basically all of these companies to be able to invest in them. And what you're hoping for, let's just use an example. So let's say Databricks is at 62 billion in their latest valuation. Let's say an employee, a longtime employee at Databricks has $5 million of stock to sell. And let's just say I want to buy $5 million of exposure to Databricks. I would be the buyer, they would be the seller. There would be some vehicle in between that would be the holding company of the equity, and I would be buying into that holding company. And then what would happen, and other people may be buying into it too, because they may have $500 million of equity, and I'd be buying one chunk of that. So that's an example of an SPV. And what would happen is, let's say in 12 months, Databricks goes public for $100 billion valuation. So then I would potentially be able to sell my equity at that public listing or shortly thereafter and be able to get the value out of the equity. So that's the idea. So I wanted to put this up and I wanted to give this to you as something to react to and what you think, based on what you see here, just kind of how you see these companies
Yeah.
and what you think are perhaps attractive on this list, if there's anything that kind of catches your eye.
I think SpaceX and Anduril being at the top of the list makes like perfect sense. Like these are two generational companies, once in a
Mm-hmm.
like couple decades sort of companies. Anthropic being this high up, I'm surprised by. I don't think it's like I don't think it's a overhyped company necessarily. I'm just surprised it's number three, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. Stripe and Databricks, folks have been waiting for their IPO for something like 5 years at this point, and each one of them just keeps raising rounds, which is super annoying.
Yeah.
I'm very positive on what like the Databricks product is just in general, like their moat and just like how much like user love they have and how widely encompassing their product is just like super strong. I think I know I bet you probably have opinions on the OpenAI one, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just react to a couple of these. Anthropic at 18 versus XAI at 50. If I were to pick one of those two that I think is more attractive, I would rather get into Anthropic at 18 than XAI at 50. And this gets back to what you said in the previous segment about Anthropic, which is, so Anthropic, for context, is the company that makes Claude, which is the model that Lakshya and I both use for coding in Cursor, which is an interface. So um, I think the right play for Anthropic is to forget about the consumer market and
Yeah,
just go enterprise.
yeah,
And I would forget about trying to be an app builder and I would just be the power underneath every app builder if
yeah,
I could. I think that's the right play for Anthropic. They have very little awareness at the consumer level. They have less
yeah.
awareness, I would guess, than Perplexity, for example.
Yes, I
And
agree.
so,
But their
yeah,
developer consciousness is just so high. Like you and
yes,
I would probably advocate for developing with Claude
yes,
over developing with
exactly.
OpenAI.
It'd be our default, yeah. And so I think that's the right play is go to enterprise, make it really easy to build. And they could even go, dare I say, buy companies like Cursor and just build their footprint there in that space. I think that would be the right play if you were running Anthropic. They've got great models. I really like the way their models interact. So I'm a big fan of Anthropic, especially at 18 versus XAI at 50. And looking down the list a little bit, Perplexity's on the list at 9 billion.
I
I
haven't
would
noticed
rather,
that. That's really surprising, to be
yeah,
honest.
I would rather have Anthropic at 18 versus Perplexity at 9. What's your reaction to that?
I agree. what Perplexity raised a round Series B. They raised 73.6 million, if I'm reading. Yeah, Series B in January of last year. That's really surprising. I mean, I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Perplexity is not a company I'm very long on. It makes sense to me. Like, they'll probably like live for a little bit longer. I think they'll continue to do okay just because they have so much like distribution. They have a consumer foothold, but just feels to me like their space is going to get implicitly eroded because they're not the vernacular for search or information traversal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like they definitely have like very intense user love, but you're going up against OpenAI putting search into like what people treat as AI equals ChatGPT. Like they're just not too deep in public consciousness for I think to want to be long on what they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. And to just delineate this again for users, Perplexity is not a model maker. They are a an app built on top of the operating system. To go back to that analogy, they can easily plug into different models. So if you really prefer the DeepSeek model, or you really prefer the O3 model, or a Claude model, Perplexity will allow you to use any of those, and they have an interface innovation that makes it feel more like a Google search than like a chat with a chat GPT. But Anthropic is a model maker. They are a research organization. They are building frontier models. So that goes back to the wrapper versus GPT. Perplexity is definitely a wrapper, and Anthropic is a foundation model maker.
Yeah, I think Perplexity they'll have time. I think like they have plenty of time to like spin out like the correct direction ways that they want to take things. So I do think they'll survive. I don't think like the underline of AI search engine is one that lasts super long. I think they'll have to find a different avenue to like what their company tagline is. But I have seen like they're also kind of debating with the wrapper versus OS thing where I know that they've been buffering up their API a lot because wanting to search and putting an LM with your search is just such a common thing. And they've
Mm-hmm.
obviously built a really good system that has all the servers that can proxy IPs and not get blocked for you. That
Mm-hmm.
instead of you just going straight to an Anthropic or straight to an OpenAI, just saying, give me an LM chat completions thing. If you want LMs, want citations and true sources, and they're serving that as an API. I think they're wanting to push that as a use case
Mm-hmm.
and trying to figure out where they slot in on the whole OS versus app side.
Where I think this goes ultimately for Perplexity, not I don't think this is going to happen in the near term, but ultimately I think Perplexity will be an acquisition by someone who wants the audience. That could be Bing, that could be Google Search. Perplexity is building audience, and I think the likely outcome is that they become an acquisition target for the desire for the eyeballs.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm inclined to agree. I think they have a bunch of like really really big investors. I think it's just if they can't get out of search as their primary offering in the next like 2 or 3 years, they're gonna get eroded by quite a bit. I think if they try and get acquired before then, I think they're fine. But we'll have to see.
Yeah. All right, so let's wrap it up there. Thanks for listening in today. Lakshya and I are happy to be able to put on a pod. We miss Damon, but please like and subscribe. Listen to us on Spotify, on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.
Out a little, out a little.